So Jean is a researcher here at the Paris Brain Institute, and he leads the motivation, brain and behavior team together with Mathias Fisiglione and Sébastien Bourret. And Jean has a computational perspective to investigate how the brain makes decisions. And today he will talk about synaptic plasticity in the OFC and risk attitude. And thank you very much, Jean, for being here. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm the local guy. So I'm going to talk about range adaptation effectively. And just right now, so this is the work of Jules Brochard, who used to do his PhD with me, and now he's doing a postdoc, and very soon he's going to leave to a much better paid job. So this is in major revision right now, and I'm really happy to have any feedback at the moment on this work. So this is a session on artificial neural networks, and I guess everyone trying to use something like that is trying to get closer to how the brain solves things, right? So how to, I mean, one way we could use those tools, those mathematical modeling tools, I guess I'm going to convince you of that, is to try to account for potential biological constraints or stuff that neurons have to deal with when trying to solve a more or less complex problem. And of course, some of the things that were presented before are along these lines, but here, so I'm going to go jump into it, because the branch adaptation, I take it as a paradigmatic example of what I mean here. So this is the example of a range adaptation in value-sensitive neurons. So in that experiment, so monkeys have it's a value-based choice. And then there are two conditions, one in which the difference in value between the two options is low or narrow, and one in which it's wide or bigger. And when you look at, the response of the OFC neurons to value, which is here proxied by the volume of the juice that is used to reward the monkeys with for their choice, you see this kind of pattern. So effectively, what you see here is that when the difference in value is narrow, irrespective of the actual range of value, the response of the OFC neurons have a minimum and a maximum value that is the same. So there's a preservation of the range of outputs, if you will. So the idea here is that those neurons range adapt in the sense that they change their response properties, the slope of the psychometric function that transform value into response outputs to match the range to match their physiological range. And that experiment, there's a number of experiments like this. This is another one where now there are different conditions where the range in values varies. And when you see effectively this, so on the graph here, can you see the arrow? No, there's no arrow. So, okay. So you see here on the y-axis, this is the firing rate of OFC neurons. On the x-axis, this is the alpha value, and the color code just tells you the range of the values that were used in this experiment to compare with. And what you see here again is that the relationship, the coefficients of proportionality between value and the firing rate of OFC neurons is effectively decreasing with the range of values that is being compared in the task. And again, that makes sense if you think of that in terms of efficient coding, for example. If there's a bounded range of physiological activity that the neurons can use to actually transmit information about value, then those neurons, so to say, don't want to be in their saturating zone, right? So they want to avoid that. They want to preserve as much contrast as possible between the different values of the options. And to do that, well, branch adaptation is a way to do that. But of course, so value is not always like just a given thing, right? So sometimes you have to construct value out of attributes. And then in that case, value is not, potentially at least not, or should not be thought in terms of the input to those neurons, but rather the output of it. So it's not that these neurons are transmitting value information, they are constructing information from something else and they transform it into value. And then in that case, it does not make as much sense to consider range adaptation as efficient coding for value. And so, or at least the story needs to be a bit more complex than this. So what we did is that we took a like a very simple example of a situation like this. So where effectively this is a gambling task, where people have to construct the value of a gamble by effectively deciding whether they want to gamble on a proposition that is made something like this. If you say yes, you take a 50% chance of winning some amount of money and 50% chance of losing some amount of money, right? And then in that task, the prospective gains and losses are varied. So the value of gambling is just made of these two attributes, prospective gains and prospective losses, right? But the value itself is, again, like a construct of that thing. So just one detail here, the gamble outcomes are only revealed at the end of the experiment. So there's no learning possible here, right? So you're just shown the possible prospective gains and losses. Do you gamble, yes or no? Next trial with a different pair of gains and losses. So 15 years ago, doing an experiment like this would get you into science. And people did, and the data sets that I'm using is effectively a reproduction of that study, where effectively there are two groups of participants. One that I call the narrow range group, for which effectively the range of gains and losses that are proposed to the subjects are the same. They vary between $5 and $20. And in the wide range group, the range of losses is the same, but the range of gains is twice the range of losses. So the only difference between the two groups, the task is exactly the same. The only difference is the range of gains that is proposed to the subjects. So we know, for example, that the VMPFC, somehow its activity correlates with the overall value of the gamble, which increases with prospective gains, decreases with prospective losses. Okay, now the first question is there anything like range adaptation that we can evidence here? So if you think of that task from the point of view of decision theory, two predictions you make. Well, first of all, what is the gamble's expected value? Well, it's just 50% times the gain minus the loss. And you should also predict that, well, the probability of gambling is independent from the range of risks prospects, right? So it's just made out of the gamble's expected value. And this is the result. So on the x-axis, you got the gamble's expected value. On the y-axis, this is the probability for all the subjects in this data set to gamble, given the expected value. Blue, you got the wide range people. Red, you got the narrow range people. And what you see here is that this gray bar indicates those trials or those bets that people have to make in those groups that have the same expected value. So for the same expected value, given that you are overall being in a favorable environment or not, you don't gamble in the same manner. So that's the hallmark of range adaptation. Right. So can we say a bit more about this? Can we decompose a bit what's going on? So the first thing we did was a very simple thing. We did a logistic regression, just trying within subject to predict, whether people gamble or not according to gains and losses. And then these are the regression parameters. So on the right, you got the sensitivity to losses. On the left, you got sensitivity to gains. And what you see here is that by increasing the range of the gains, you actually decrease both the sensitivity to gains and to losses. And then the question arises as to, is that a static effect? Does that unfold over time? So we did the same analysis, but this time on chunks of trials. So like the 10 first ones, then the 10 after, and then 10 after that, and stuff like this. So we could effectively look at what happens over time. And then we took a very simple summary statistics of what's going on. So we just took the ratio between sensitivity to losses and gains. So that's effectively loss aversion, if you will. And that's what you see here. So this is time on the x-axis. This is the loss aversion index on the y-axis. And what you see here is that at the beginning, both groups are the same in terms of loss aversion. But then as time unfolds, effectively the people from the narrow range group end up with no loss aversion, so same sensitivity for gains and losses, whereas the blue group, so to say, the groups that are experiencing a more favorable environment, wider gain prospects, they, so to say, preserve a loss aversion with some temporary bump in there. So that's a process that unfolds over time. They start the same, and then they change to end up differently. And so it's a range adaptation that is effectively occurring over time. So there's something that changes in the response of the system that we want to explain. So the first explanation would be, well, maybe people, those bits of the brain that are responsive to or processing gains and or losses, those guys are undergoing some form of efficient coding. So, well, I mean, there's one way to test that, which is so we want to look in those brain regions that encodes gain, loss, or expected value, and show that there is a significant, if you will, coefficient of proportionality, significance difference of coefficient of proportionality between the gains and the response of those brain regions between the two groups. So this is just an example. So we tried everything, gains, losses, expected value, subjective values, whatever. We find in both groups of people effectively that those quantities are typically represented in the UFC, but there's no significant difference between the two groups. So it's not as if in the VMPFC or elsewhere in the brain. So it's not as if a simple explanation like its range adaptation in terms of the attributes of those gambles that explains the effects. It's not there in the brain, at least not in this kind of analysis. And then the second thing that is a bit puzzling to us. So when we did this temporal analysis, we could, for each chunk of trials, there is a specific range of gains and or loss, and we could actually derive or look at the relationship between here the sensitivity to losses as a function of the range of gains for these chunks of trials. And what you see here is that as the range of gains increases, the sensitivity to losses decreases, and that's true both, across groups and also within groups across time. And there's a spillover effect. So that's a spillover effect, right? So that means that if you change the sensitivity to gains, the range of gains, you change people's sensitivity to losses. And that's going to be very difficult to explain in terms of a simple range adaptation for either gains or losses. So we thought, okay, let's try to explain this kind of stuff with an artificial neural network that tries to solve the problem the way people are. So this is an example of an ANN that solves a very simple task, effectively doing gains minus losses, right? Trivial. But it is working under some constraints. The constraints are those units have bounded response ranges. So in this network, you got two layers, one that is attribute specific and one that is integrating the outputs of those attribute specific units. And we try to read out the gamble value out of the integration layer. And we have effectively two kinds of units activation functions, either sigmoidal, so that's just constraining those units to have a bounded response range, or pseudo-Gaussian, so that's on top of that, effectively restricting the response fields of those units to bounded range as well. So as such, the network cannot do any range adaptation, right? It's just, we can fit those networks to the behavior of the people. It would produce the same response for each pair of gains and losses that we would drive the network with. So, but that's a starting point to construct a network that is able to integrate the attributes of those options to construct value. And so here is an example of the sort of receptive fields you get out of these networks. So if you train this network to produce the gamble values, you start with a random connectivity. There's very few constraints to predict gamble value. So you have pretty much arbitrary receptive fields. So those graphs show you in color-coded the amount of activity there is here in that toy network with 4 integration units, as loss and gains vary. And you see that those shapes are really like almost arbitrary. But of course, I mean, this network can reproduce value, right? So it's been trying to do that, and it's doing it correctly with the right sensitivity of gains and losses. And of course, now because each combination of gains and losses correspond to a given value, we can look at the statistical relationship there is, or potentially there is, between the unit's activity and value itself. And this is the sort of relationship we see. So again, pretty much arbitrary. So these graphs on the bottom on x-axis, you got value. On y-axis, you got the units outputs. Again, value is the output of the network. So that's just looking at, binning value and looking at the average amount of activity we find in that unit for that given value, which corresponds to a given pair of gains and losses. And you see those relationships are arbitrary. So again, this is a signal that if you want to use range adaptation, it's not going to be in the way people have described it so far, because that's not going to work. So how do we put range adaptation in there? Well, I guess we could still use the notion of efficient coding to some extent. So those units have to transmit information. The information, at least in the integration units, is made of a weighted combination of those attributes units layers, weighted by their connectivity and passed through either a sigmoidal or a Gaussian transformation. And somehow, if the inputs are such that the response actually reaches saturation units, one way of solving the issue here to preserve the contrast between those different types of inputs is to shift the response slope of that unit, exactly like efficient coding would tell you it should be doing. And that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, potentially at least, is to change the upstream connectivity between the attribute layers and the integration layer in the integration units, such that the actual weighted combination of the inputs now is within the range of the responsive range of the integration units. So quantitatively, those two operations do the same thing. They effectively replace the distribution of inputs within the responsive range of the units, but the mechanism is very different. The first one really is about changing the response properties of the units. The second one is about changing the connections between the attribute layer and the integration layer. And okay, to tell the story short, that's easy to implement. So having a parameter that describes the slope of the activation function, we know how to make that parameter change to do this efficient coding. Same thing with a connectivity. And in fact, the connectivity change that you should apply really looks like hebbian connectivity. In the end, it has the form of the product of the input and the output times something plus something. And the coefficients here actually depends on the shape of the activation function, the connectivity structure, the threshold parameters and stuff like this. But at least the rule itself is really like simple, like almost, it's like neo-hebbian, if you will. So, and when you implement this kind of stuff, and you in those networks, so you train the network to produce value, then you put those mechanisms in there, and then you look at how they change their response profile and how they change effectively the value that is produced by those networks. So, for example, as a summary, you do again like a regression and look at how sensitive they are to gains and losses. This is the kind of patterns you see. So when you increase the range of losses, in general, you decrease both sensitivity to gains and losses. Same thing with when you increase the range of gains. So they show two things. First of all, one thing that you should expect, which is that sensitivity to gains decreases with the range of gain, but also a spillover effect. When you change the range of losses, you change the sensitivity to gains. When you change the range of gains, you change the sensitivity to losses. Okay, so we fit those models to people's behavior in this task. And I'm showing you here what I call the post-diction error rate, right? So it's just the amount of trials that were incorrectly predicted or fitted by the network. And so on average, they do very well. So, okay, sorry, I've got 2 minutes. Okay. On average, they do well. I've got 6 models. Okay. On the top row, you see those models with Gaussian activation functions. On the bottom row, you see those ones with sigmoid activation functions. Left is ANNs without any plastic mechanism in there, unable to produce range adaptation. In the middle, those are models with efficient coding kind of like mechanisms. And on the right, these are hebbian plasticity like range adaptation mechanisms. Okay, so the first piece of evidence that we try to look at is whether those models actually can predict what people from one group would have done if they were exposed to the gambles that were proposed to the other group. So we want to generalize across risk range context, if you want. And to tell the story short here, the only model that can actually predict correctly out of sample the change in the risk attitude of people according to risk context is the ANN models with a hebbian plasticity mechanism in there with a Gaussian activation function. All the other ones can't do that. Effectively, when asked about what the other people when fit on one group of people and asked about what the other guys would have done, they respond, they would have done like the group of people I've been fitted with. The only model that does not do that and actually correctly predicts the reversal of the risk attitudes is the model with hebbian plasticity in there. That's the first piece of evidence that maybe this model is capturing something that is there. And the way it's doing that, of course, is using the fact that across time, when fitted to the series of trials of those people, there is a specific dynamics of the change in the gamble behavior of those people, and it's using that to trying to get at the right parameters in there, get at the right connectivity structures, and effectively be able to generalize. Then we did something that we could do as well here, given that we had fMRI data. We just simply did RSA. So we took those fitted networks, and then we look at the patterns of activity along these networks. We computed like a trial-by-trial dissimilatory matrix composed of effectively how the pattern of activity in those integration layers were looking alike. And then we did the same thing with fMRI, and we compared those two RDMs to measure how similar those networks predicted activity were to the fMRI data in different regions of the OFC. So okay, this slide is ugly, but effectively, the short story here again is that the only model that predicts in both groups of people correctly the patterns of activation, the similarity of the multivariate similarity of activations in the OFC, and in particular in Bruman area 11, is the ANN with hebbian plasticity in there. None on the other model actually can do that. Okay, so how late am I? 1 more minute. Okay. So maybe I have one piece of information I could share again. So, then after having done all this, I mean, we looked like, you looked at what those fitted ANN units looked like. What were their response profiles, and we did something. I mean, of course, like we could look at receptive fields for each unit, but that's a mess. So we did something that people have done in the past. We simply classified those units into choice unit, chosen value units, offer value units. You probably are aware of that work by Camilo Padua-Chopa. And effectively what we see is that those integration units, we use the exact same procedure. So if you know this work, this is exactly the same. And effectively, we find those chosen value and offer value cells, if you will, in these integration units. The key point being that they're not choice cells or chosen value cells or offer value cells. They're just integration units in a network that tries to construct value out of gains and losses. And of course, we looked at other things as well, but we checked that it was actually producing range adaptation in value, despite not being efficient coding of value. And the network was doing this as well. I'm going to stop there, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, Jean. I think this is just a way to get you to have another minute to give your talk. But I wondered if you could just go back to the predictions of the model and take us through kind of what features of the graph mean that the one with the hebbian plasticity best matches the behavioral predictions, because I guess when we were looking at those, it kind of looked like all of them were seeming to show the adaptation in the high range versus low range. And so that one, yeah.
Okay. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. So x-axis is expected value, y-axis is probability of gambling. The dots with the R bars are the data. The plain lines are the fitted probability of gamble on the actual, that's post-diction, to say. So red is narrow range, blue is wide range. So here, plain red lines show you how the model fits the data it's been fitted to. And the dotted line shows you, okay, now I fitted those for each participant, those models to the blue, sorry, to the red people. And I'm taking those models, I'm giving it the series of prospective gains and losses of each participant in the blue group. And I'm asking what this model of the red group actually would have done in the blue group, and that's the blue dotted line. So the fact that the blue dotted lines overlaps with the red plain lines means that they don't generalize. Would you turn the model on the red group, being asked what the blue group would be doing, it says as the same as the red group.
I have a follow-up to that question. So when you look at your out of sample predictions, the lines seem to sort of asymptote or stick to the level of when you get to the points of the data that you didn't train them on. Do you have an idea what's going on there?
Yeah. So thank you, Hanneke, for the question. So so what I'm interested in really is the common range of values there, because that's the stuff that is really the signature of range adaptation. Those are the trials that are exactly the same in terms of the combination of gains and losses, in terms of their magnitude for both groups of people. So if the model is trying to reverse the prediction here, he's actually accounting for the fact that on average, they are more beneficial outside this range or not. And that changes the response to those kinds of trials. But you're right. So here, for example, for that input that behaves that as well, there is the prediction is not that good outside the common range. And effectively, that's because, so again, the blue dotted line has been trained on trials that go from there to there, the red trials, so he didn't know at all how to behave for values that are there. So it is crappy at generalizing outside the range. But I consider a job that is okay, in the sense that, again, so there's no constraint in this network to have a really like a continuous increase of gamble behavior as value changes because of its structure. So again, I repeat, what I think is important here is that it's able to predict correctly the change in the risk attitudes within the common expected value range. But I agree, outside it's not doing very well.
One last question.
So I got a general naive question. So you show that when you report the result that when you increase the range of in the gains, it affects in the losses, and on a kind of basic psychological dimension, it kind of makes sense because you have more money, so you can earn to lose more money in somehow. So do you believe that if we are choosing the negative output in another dimension, like orthogonal to money, maybe something like RPUF or delay, you would see the same effect than increasing the gain will also the range of the gain will influence something in a loss dimension?
I'm not quite sure I understood properly the question. So
I can try to rephrase it. Okay. So loss and gain are on the same dimension with money.
Yeah.
And so it kind of makes sense that if you're going to earn more money, it impacts the losses because they are on the same dimension. And so the question is that is it the effect on gain on losses? Is it because it's on the same dimension, or do you think that if you choose another stimulus on the negative side of the like
Okay.
puff or delay, will you have the same effect?
So I guess if I take seriously these results, I would say that you get similar spillover effects among attributes that are relevant to construct value, irrespective of the fact that they are both money related or not. So, so if you, I don't know, if you construct the value of a food item by healthiness and pleasantness, for example, then I'd expect a similar spillover effects among attributes, despite the fact that they are incommensurate.
Okay, time is out. Thank you very much, Jean, for your wonderful talk.